Okay, thank you for joining today's Safety Roundtable session. Good to see lots of you here on the Zoom, and there'll be others who are watching along live or following this on a replay, perhaps enjoying it on the podcast as well as it goes out as a replay on the podcast too. So wherever you are, thanks for joining this session. And we're going to be speaking today about compliance and asking the question, as you may have seen in some of the promotion of this, is compliance a dirty word? So let's get into it and speak about compliance. Thank you to everybody for joining. So the starting point for this is, just to be clear, not that I'm saying we don't want to be compliant from the perspective of we don't want to be doing anything around safety, clearly. But I suppose what I'm wanting to discuss today, and this is going to be an interactive session as these always are, is compliance enough? So does compliance take us far enough? Should we be aiming for compliance, or should we be aiming further? What are the benefits of just aiming for compliance, and what outcomes do we get from that? What are the benefits of going a bit further? What outcomes can we get from that, and how could we go about doing that? So that's the perspective that I want to talk about today. I'm sure you'd be surprised if I said all of a sudden that I no longer thought we should be doing anything around safety to even achieve a level of compliance. So, but it's always worth clarifying, just in case somebody's joining for the first time. So, what does compliance mean? Let's just define that as a first point here. I found a couple of definitions, but I'd be interested if anybody on the Zoom wants to go to reactions, raise their hand, and then I can ask them to unmute themselves, how you would understand the word compliance. So the state or fact of according with or meeting rules or standards is the kind of general definition of compliance. But when we think specifically about health and safety compliance, a good definition I found was an ongoing process of complying with the health and safety standards established by regulatory legislators and bodies. If anybody's got any divergence with that definition, then feel free to pop it into the chat wherever you're watching, or if you're on the Zoom with me, go to reactions, raise your hand, and you can come and chat it through. Always keen to get people's perspectives on these things. If you've got a slightly different definition, then do let me know. I'm going to keep letting people in as we go as well. I've got to make sure to monitor people coming in. So here's a question for you. Let me know in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, come and unmute. Phil, where did I get those definitions from? One's a dictionary definition, and the other one, I did a search for different definitions of compliance within health and safety. I can't remember where I found that one from, but that one was the one that I felt was kind of ticked the best box that I could find. Hope that answers the question. Let's just check everything. Big ones. So, yeah, here's the question. I'm not going to ask you. I wouldn't want you to answer this question about your current organisation, but let me know from your prior organisation's perspective, bearing in mind that last definition of compliance. Do you think that your prior organisation was compliant with every single health and safety standard established by regulatory legislators and bodies? What do you think about that? Do you think that your prior organisation was? Again, don't answer for your current organisation, because nobody's then going to answer no. I've got a few yeses coming in on the various platforms. A couple of people saying no. I think it's quite difficult to comply with every single point, which I think was the point I was trying to make. So let's try and define this a bit more closely. And in a bit more detail. and these are my definitions rather than something that I've found. So anything to add to this, please let me know. So I thought of five key areas around compliance within a health and safety context. So these are the kind of areas that we should be focusing on to achieve that level of compliance. But again, the question is, should we be going further than this? That's the bigger question we're going to be asking today. Firstly, was adherence to laws and regulations. So making sure that you're following whatever the laws are in the jurisdiction that you're in. If you're operating in multiple countries, then you're going to have different health and safety legislation and laws in different jurisdictions, I'm sure. And secondly, ensuring that your practices and what you're actually doing are aligning with those legal requirements. Secondly, thinking about industry standards. This is an interesting one. As we get into this in a bit more detail, and I talk about my field of slips, trips, and falls, this recalls to me some industry standards that I worked on for a group in the wet leisure industry. So it was all about managing slip risks in wet areas of leisure centres, hotels, etc. And were people following that industry practice, or were they reverting back to something that was more generic? So we should be, to be compliant, meeting specific industry guidelines and best practices. And these are often, like the example I gave, governed by industry organizations as well as obviously by regulatory bodies. Third thing was around internal policies. So are we abiding by our company specific rules and ethical guidelines? If you didn't listen to it, I did a really interesting two-part podcast episode with Simon, what's his name? Simon Cassin. I couldn't remember his surname for a second there, about ethics in safety. And that was focused on is a zero harm approach to health and safety ethical, but we talked a lot about ethics more broadly as well. And ensuring that your team members and your subcontractors on site, etc., are understanding and following internal protocols. Fourth thing, documentation and reporting. So making sure you've got accurate records of your safety and compliance activities and reporting regularly to your key stakeholders. And then lastly, I thought continuous monitoring and improvement. So making sure that risk assessments are not standalone point in time documents, but they are being regularly reviewed. They're living and breathing documents, and that we're updating practices and policies to meet what's happening in the world. You know, if the world is changing, laws are changing, standards are changing, regulations are changing, etc. Any thoughts on anything that maybe I've missed, or is there anything to add in to that list that anybody could think of? Feel free to, if you're on the Zoom, to raise your hand and unmute and have a chat with me about it, or you can always pop it into the chat box instead. Phil, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just saying, I put some things in the chat, but the thing that keeps coming back to me are compliance in a health and safety context. What about your own personal ethics, your own personal standards that you want to adhere to, you want to comply to?
Yeah.
Unwritten sort of thing that's difficult to put in there, but perhaps that's a different way of looking at compliance. It's not just industry standards, ISO, whatever. It's your own personal ethics, thinking perhaps more. You might have certain things, your professional bodies you member of, you may need to comply with.
Yeah.
Perhaps linked to your ethics and your professional practice as opposed to your organisation complying to standards.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, because you've got to be able to look yourself in the mirror, haven't you, at the end of the day? How do you kind of, or how would you advise somebody, Phil, to square a circle? You know, if let's say your own, and this is part of this wider discussion, I suppose, but let's say your own ethics around what you think was a minimum viable standard were over and above what the sort of compliance rules and regulations said, and perhaps your company or organization was pushing you to do the minimal level of thing versus what you felt was the right thing to do. How would you feel about that? And then how would you suggest that people try and deal with that if that scenario ever came up?
I suppose my civilian career, I've been fortunate enough that I've only ever worked for organisations that want to go way above the minimum standards, the minimum compliance, shall we say. So it's really difficult for me to comment on that. Um, and I suppose I can't really talk much about my military career, so we'll leave that for one side for a moment. It's difficult for me to comment on the from purely
Yeah,
health and safety perspective as a civilian.
yeah,
So I think if anybody's worked for an organisation that wants to go just below the minimum standard and hope they get away with it, I'd be really happy to hear about their experiences.
yeah. If anybody's feeling brave and wants to talk about that, then again, probably from a historic perspective rather than a current organisation, then feel free to join in. I can see in the chat there's a couple of comments about with some extra ideas. Rosemary's mentioned that it's missing the human element. Yeah, it is, and I think that we're going to get onto that in a bit because I think um, the dry definition, to use your word, of compliance is all about meeting those minimums, and I think the human bit is the more exciting and interesting bit, which hopefully we'll get onto in a minute. Mike, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in, share some thoughts? Oh, unmute yourself, Mike.
There we go. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Yeah, I think
That's
it's
all
a
right.
very, really interesting comment you made, which chimes with myself as well. Probably not fully answered there, but yes, sometimes there is a legal minimum standard, and particularly when you're working in other countries, and there's your standard that you believe is best, or might be a standard that you've transferred from a Western country, and then whilst you're compliant in terms of the local country, it can be a very, very difficult one to square ethically for yourself, where you know it's not ideal what they're doing, but they are meeting the legal requirements.
Yeah, exactly. And that is difficult, isn't it? Because, as an organization, let's say you're based in the UK and you're operating around the world. Um, Again, if anybody's got any perspectives on this, be really interested to hear them. But you would sort of feel ethically that you should try to, I guess, to adhere to, what would be expected of a UK organization in the UK, irrespective of where you were. But there's going to be that sort of conflict, isn't there, between, this is going to cost us X and it's going to take Y time, and we don't really need to do it in this country versus it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. I think that's, very often a conundrum that I've faced.
Yeah. And where have you ended up on that typically? Have you managed to make the human argument to say, no, we need to go above and beyond here, and has that succeeded, or have you found it sort of a difficult thing to get across the line?
It can be difficult to get across time, particularly if it is uh, takes a lot more time. I think very often the money argument has not been that difficult to win. I think the companies I've worked with have been quite happy about investing money. But when
Mm,
you're telling that you probably need an extra person to make sure that you can fulfill this, I think that's usually where you get serious pushback.
mm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I did a podcast interview today um, with a guy called Adam Clark, and we were talking about some of the challenges of needing that extra person really to make things hum and tick. Because if you're a single person in a relatively large organization, you can only ever be firefighting and reactive. Whereas sometimes it does come down to the resource. So yeah, interesting that you face that challenge, Mike. Thanks for sharing. Peter, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hello. And hi to Phil as well. Um, we used to work together. It's nice to see you on the call. Um, this is UK perspective only. Whilst there's lots of regulations that are quite prescriptive and you must do X, Y, Z, there's such a lot within the duty of care level and the fact of risk assessing and then reducing the risk as low as reasonably possible that it's quite difficult to then um, say what the minimum is. Then it's all about our professional competence to be able to assess those, and then how do we sell sell the story that comes out of that? Because then actually anything that you would do, if you're doing a good risk assessment and you say, well, this is the level, then it's about what level of risk you accept. And if you're showing that you've assessed something which is above that level of acceptance, then that is legally required, and that then becomes a compliance thing. I think it's too easy. It may be through lack of understanding from maybe some management that they'd think of some of the traditionals that this is the minimum that you have to do. It's almost like a tick box. I'll do this and nothing more. But the law doesn't say that.
This is one of the challenges with the UK law, and I don't know enough about other countries to comment on there. But the principle of reasonably practicable and suitable and sufficient risk assessments, and it's all quite woolly and fuzzy, isn't it? And in certain areas, certainly in my area, as I'll talk about in a minute, the fact that it's not very prescriptive in what the rules and regulations say, but actually when you end up in court, it does become very prescriptive and it almost becomes black and white, isn't really very helpful, because you're sort of feeling as if you could be feeling as if you're doing everything you need to do to be compliant. But actually, if you're being judged on a different metric when it comes down to it at the end of the day, then that perhaps feels a little bit unfair as well. Andy, how are you doing today? Oh, you need to unmute, Andy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, two things here. From my own experience in terms of risk assessment and how they could be applied, especially in big organizations. This can vary on the leadership and management leadership in those departments, because some are more proactive, and it also depends on the amount of risk there is in those departments. Obviously, those working in them areas are going to be a lot more demanding, as opposed to somebody like humanities, like geography, history, where the risk is practically very low. The other aspect is, now that we have a new government, one wonders whether they'll bring EU, British government safety standards, or at least align them with those that are in the EU. It's one of those things that could happen. I don't know how they will see it, but it's something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, that second point is definitely very, very relevant. I mean, I would think, or I would hope that, if anything, our safety standards would, from a health and safety perspective, not necessarily food safety, for example, because I know there's different views on that, but I'd think that and hope that our standards would exceed the EU standards, and they should be, if anything, trying to follow our lead on that. But so yeah, we'll look out for that for sure. Darren, what did you want to come in on?
Christian, I've finally made it to one.
Good man.
I can't stay for all of it, unfortunately. The compliance issues that I've had in the past is with companies that use a compliance as a program to police and measure from. And that's great. You go to the exec team and ask them why they want an ISO standard, and they can't really tell you, other than, well, we can't work with these people if they say we haven't got it. So it's become a bit of a club. The standards really, if it ever came to court, are only have the level of standing of an ACOP as a base level. They don't really have a legal standing. And I originally did my training with NEBOSH, but years later, as a refresh, I did NCRQ before it disappeared. and NCRQ had a different approach. So would it be reasonably practicable for all companies to get a standard and maintain it? Because there's a lot of time, effort, and cost. And for some small businesses, probably isn't. So to determine that you're only going to work with people that have got it, you might be putting yourself in a position where you can't get some of the support or services or goods that you need. For me, they become a bit of a badge. The problem is, if you drive everything from a compliance point of view, it's brilliant. And I can tell you that in my previous role, we had standards and nobody thought a thing about them right up to 2 weeks before the external auditor was coming in. And then I'd run around like a mad fool for 2 weeks auditing the whole bloody company, because everything I found could then not be brought up again in the external audit. They've done nothing for 50 weeks. Now all of a sudden, oh, we're perfect. We've retained it. No, you haven't. But if you police from a compliance only point of view, all you're ever going to get is belligerent compliance. And that's the key for me. You've got to do safety with people, not to them. So I'm not a fan of the standards. The other issue is some of the other standards that people use are actually different to regulation. So when you look at approved document B, fire safety of building regs, and look at some of the tables in there for escape routes and people through them, those numbers and tables in the regulation are different to the ones in the British Standard. We're already on the back foot as an argument. Yes, the British Standard can actually be utilised as a level, so you can build a building to the British Standard that's not actually compliance with the regulation. So we're falling over ourselves with inconsistencies. That's the issue behind it.
Yeah, it's difficult, and the list of things that you could potentially want to be the box of which you want to be ticking, it could be endless as well. So it's almost impossible.
You can only go with the regulation as a primary if you're talking true compliance. The rest is all backup and supportive evidence. The problem arises is when, and I've had this a lot, where the safety team are managed by the quality team. And that's where their idea of compliance, they love nothing better than just having an electronic system that collates compliance evidence. And it's, as long as it's in date and it's in there, great. That's all they're interested in. But it doesn't actually help with the physical safety and management of safety of the people on the site. It's just an evidence collection point.
No, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Darren. It leads nicely into to the next point that I was gonna make, which is about some of the potential downsides of compliance. And there's a phrase that I've heard used before, compliance fog, which I like and really resonates with me. So I think there are benefits, as we've talked about, to being compliant. And obviously we want to be compliant, because if we're not compliant, then we're not even meeting that bare minimum. But if we just focus on compliance, the three key big challenges or blockers, inhibitors, that I have seen as a result are, firstly, a false sense of security. So, are we compliant? If you're sitting in a board meeting and the question is, are we compliant? Yes or no? Or are we safe? Yes or no? That's quite a difficult question to answer. But if you're saying, are we compliant or not? Yes, well, that could give you a very much a false sense of security. We're not being proactive. We're not really trying to do the best. We're just trying to meet those minimum standards. It really engenders, and we've talked about this, a box ticking mentality. So we're thinking not about, are we actually providing a safe environment, but are we ticking the boxes on our checklists, and are we completing our paperwork on time, rather than looking to genuinely address the safety issues and improving on best practice. And then I think the third key drawback of the kind of compliance fog mentality is, as you just said, Darren, you don't then have an engaged workforce. if it's just a sort of box ticking bureaucratic thing we have to do, as you say, once a year, and then we just do it and move on, then we're not developing a good culture around safety. We're going to have low engagement around safety, poor motivation, and bad things are going to happen. Darren, you want to come back in?
Yeah, it's just a point around the box ticking and false sense of security, really. There's a lot of companies that are starting to out there with electronic management systems around the compliance. And they're all pretty similar. I've looked into loads of them and I've used one. And one of the reasons I don't like necessarily using them is if I go out and do an audit or an inspection, I have to log every action into the system. I have to allocate it to somebody who's responsible for that area. That sends them an automated email telling them they've got to deal with this issue.
Yeah.
And if they don't deal with it at a certain time, it then automatically goes to his boss, who goes and gives them a kicking. I have yet to find a system that actually you allocate it to a number of people and it automatically sets a meeting for them to go and stand and look at it, engage with each other to overcome the issue with a solution. They don't drive proactive engagement. They drive belligerent compliance. And when you look behind the scenes, a lot of these systems, you have a lot of salespeople, a lot of IT geeks, but not necessarily a lot of safety competence behind it. Going back to the standards, with my previous company, I took them from 18,001 through the migration to 45,001. And I don't agree with the word migration, because migration means you go somewhere for a while and you come back. That's just terminology. I won't say which company we were doing it through, but we had the same person come to site year after year, and I could take them into the workshop. I could show them the system of work folder for that particular machine. And as long as every document was in there that was supposed to be in there, it was up to date, signed by everybody, and the person using the machine was signed up to it, it was ticked off, it was fine. The problem is the individual that was doing the audit actually had no safety competence. They had a lead auditor's qualification in 45,001, but they hadn't got any safety competence. So they had no idea whether any of the control measures or the hazards and the risks in the risk assessment or instructions for that piece of equipment were actually relevant or not. It's just a paper chase. It doesn't necessarily ensure that you're compliant with the physical actions of actually doing the task. And that's where I think compliance linking to standards really falls over. We will pay a lot of money every year to maintain 45,001.
Yeah, I'd agree in my experience that interested to hear as well if anybody's found some better software that does seem to achieve more. But sometimes using the software or any technology as a crutch produces bad outcomes because you're driven down a route of doing it which might not be the best way. And yeah, they're not experts in what you do in your business, and they might not be experts in safety. They're probably experts in tech. Jonathan, you want to come in?
And then another screen popped up and completely bamboozled me.
There you go.
I think my first kind of thoughts, in terms of this slide that you've put up in here, this captures everything that I think about compliance and the problems with compliance. I think you've captured it really well in that slide. Just on the back of what Darren was saying there is, I've audited a business in the past that was 18,001, then migrated to 45,001, however you want to call it. And there were also a gold ROSPA site, and it was absolutely appalling. They had a room which was, they were sifting flour. The extraction hadn't been working for a good 6 months. It was picked up on the DSEA survey, but the health and safety manager said, "Oh, we're continuing to clean it." And all the guys going in there, they've got all the PPE on, they're absolutely fine. Or, they've got a health screen in place. But when you actually go into the room, there was just flour from, floor to ceiling. And it was none of these things that they said were in place, but the health safety manager took upon himself saying, "This is absolutely fine for us to manage it in this way." And so that kind of fell into the false sense of security of that site. Where a Gold Rosper site, we've now got 45,000 and we're fantastic. But actually, when you actually get into the site and go into these various rooms to speak to employees, it's just all surface plasters, and that's it. That is the problem with compliance from my perspective.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. That's a good summary. Darren, did you want us to come back in and add something more?
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that that company that we were going through 45,001 with, the auditor that we had has since started and been completing some of their safety competence. They've undertaken the NEBOSH cert and they're halfway through the diploma. And ironically, I'm their IOSH mentor. But it says a lot about the big. I mean, this is one of the big auditing players I'm talking about. They've got a real shortage in competence when they're on site auditing.
Yeah.
That said, having left the prior company, within 6 weeks of leaving, they did phone me up and ask me if I'd like a job. So they know they've got the issue and they are doing something about it.
Yeah.
But it really is the problem is too many companies are too busy measuring themselves, and compliance is one of the measures they use. Too busy measuring themselves against other companies. It's one-upmanship.
Yeah.
They need to focus more on where they are and where they're going to on their own journey and measure that. Because I've yet to find a company, even in the same industry, that's absolutely alike.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I left the previous company is the quality manager that we were working under. The first thing he did was come in and say he wanted to change the definition of an accident, because I know he'd promised to cut accident and incident numbers, and by doing that, he's just massaging the numbers.
Yeah.
But his new title was head of company reputation. That said it all for me. Wrong place. Don't need to be here anymore.
Yeah.
It really is. It really is becoming a badge for a lot of people for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thanks very much, Darren, for sharing. So we've looked at these three kind of key areas within the compliance fog. I just thought I would give you a bit of an insight into my area and how some of these can come to life. So think about people slipping over, right? What do we need to do to be compliant? Well, if you look at the various regulations, as I said earlier, it's all a little bit woolly. But here's an example: floors in a workplace must not be slippery so as to expose any person to a risk to their safety, from the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regulations 1992. So that's open to interpretation. What does slippery mean? Okay. The reality is, in my experience over the last 12, 15 years, if you go to court, and I'm talking about civil court here, insurance claims, much more data on that than criminal cases, but certainly in civil courts, if someone slips over and they hurt themselves, normally an expert witness is going to be commissioned to do a slip test of the floor using a pendulum. And the reality is, if you score under 36 on that test, you're going to be found that the floor was slippery, and therefore you're going to be in a difficult position aiming to defend yourself. So when it gets down to it in brass tacks, it becomes quite black and white. But the regulations are not black and white. They're kind of quite open and lots of shades of grey. So there's that false sense of security coming in potentially there. And just to give you some data on this, over the last decade plus, my team and I have tested thousands and thousands and thousands of floors, and it's on average across all of those floors, about 20% of floors that we've tested using that testing method as per HSE guidance achieve 36 plus on the pendulum test, and 80% don't. Of those 80%, around half of them could, if they were being maintained properly, achieve 36 plus, and half of them couldn't. So there's a big chunk of floors out there that are not performing such that they would pass that test, but there's that kind of false sense of security because people don't have the right data. And then there's a big chunk of floor surfaces that they're just, they're just slippery. So they're not meeting that guidance at all, but people just don't know about it. And then that's when we get the things that I rally about all the time, put a sign out that'll cover us. And we see a lot of this, too much of this in my area. And people think that is a degree of compliance. We put the sign out, so we're fine. So that's just one area. Obviously, there's a lot more areas that we could think about. Rosemary, do you want to come in?
I'll try to unmute. Yeah, kind of a general point really to everything that's been said. The problem with health and safety is too much of it. Now, there's a contentious statement. The problem is it's not specific, it's not aimed, it covers every business, every occupation, and everything everybody does when they go to work. And the problem with software, for example, is that it covers everything, and therefore it's a blanket, and blankets just drown people. Nobody actually listens or observes what's going on the ground, on the shop floor, on the construction site, whatever it is. And it's all becoming too non-specific. And it's not, at the risk of selling my own company, Simple Safety, it's not simple. And it's not simple because it's in the interest of a lot of very big companies to actually make it complicated. They sell you solutions which are enormous and irrelevant and don't apply to the business you're operating. And whether it slips, trips and falls, or I used to work for Lavazza, and who knew that coffee was actually slippery? It is, hurrah. But it's bonkers things like that. It doesn't obviously on paper that it's coffee included, but it is, and it's all those things are just too complicated. It's health and safety, whichever business you're in, needs to be very specific to the business you're in and the people you're working with, and it is hugely people-oriented. And again, at the risk of sounding trite, you've got 2 ears, 1 mouth. Use that ratio.
Definitely can't disagree with that point, for sure. Darren, you wanted to come back in again?
Yeah, I'm just picking up on the simple safety. So, the safety, the way I approach safety is simple. And that's whether I'm designing or delivering a training package or whatever I'm looking at. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, if it's not simple, people just don't or can't or won't take it on board. The other one is it has to be simple because it's me that's designing it, putting it together and delivering it. And I am pretty fundamental, I can tell you. The problem is a lot of people don't really, that too many people are far too risk averse, and they don't really understand what reasonably practicable means. And they don't really understand terms like suitable and sufficient. And that's where, in one of my presentations, I got a picture of a grey seal on a grey day on a grey rock. And that's why safety working under quality doesn't work. In quality, you either meet a standard or you don't. We are always in the grey area. And that's where the conflict comes from. And when you think about it, reasonably practicable, and I apologise to the ladies on the call here, safety legislation is still gender specific. Okay, it still talks about the reasonable man. So you've done something wrong, you're in court, and a magistrate or a jury have to determine what a fictitious person precedented in case law, who knows nothing about what you, your company, or what you're doing would have done in the same situation. It doesn't come any grayer than that.
Mm.
And the two precedents I can think of, there's the man who takes the Clapham omnibus home on 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, or the man who lives in the suburbs, mows his lawn every Sunday and takes a monthly magazine. Well, who the hell are they? Okay, so you've got a third party second-hand information decision based on a fictitious person. It's never going to be 100%. So
Right.
what we do for a living is we are playing a percentage game. As simple as that. With contributory negligence, vicarious liability, you're going to be liable for something. It's about minimizing and reducing it the best that you can. But there are too many companies still who think you can't totally cover your backside. It's as simple as that. Until you get that message through and they're comfortable and they accept that, they're never ever going to understand. And as long as they keep, especially where they're driving competence or driving compliance, and even more so where it's being done through a safety team that are managed by another team who aren't actually competent in what they're doing, the grayness just gets deeper.
Yeah.
There's more than 50 shades, I can tell you. Okay, there is not a element of industry anywhere that safety does not touch.
Yeah.
It's such a wide gamut, they don't understand it, but there are too many people in the company who have managed safety teams elsewhere, but none of them want to go through the pain and the heartache of actually getting the qualifications, let alone the experience.
Yeah.
The safety industry needs to take its industry back from those other departments who think they can do it better. Sorry, I'm on a big soapbox here.
You're on your high horse. Like it.
Do I need a harness on a horse?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Lee, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in and give us some thoughts?
This talks really well to a lot of things that I talk about with my team quite often. So keeping things simple for Rosemary as well. It's easy to forget that we have a whole range of people of different competencies doing things that we'd call compliant tasks in the built environment, not all of whom are safety practitioners or anywhere near it. And in that compliance fog, and I think that's a really good term, we lose sight of the fact that we become very task-oriented, we become very focused on doing the thing, but not actually very focused on the results that come from that. And part of that stems from the competence of the individuals doing all of these different things. So the questions that I ask my team to consider when they're looking at things are really simple questions. Does it work? Is it healthy? Is it safe? Is it good enough? They're the real standards. When you talk about compliance with the minutiae, if the answer to any of those questions is no, then fundamentally you don't comply with the general duties under Section 2 or 3 of the Act anyway. So the danger for me with compliance is we become so focused on keeping ourselves busy doing all of this stuff that we forget those questions that we should really be asking. Is it good enough? Is it safe? Is it healthy? Are we going to send our people home in one piece? And that's what I talk to my team about, like a broken record, I'd imagine.
Yeah, fully agree with that, and it kind of chimes with what I've got on the screen here, which is what you're balancing out.
So can I just pick up
yeah,
there,
Phil,
Lee,
of course,
and
Phil.
say you're completely wrong? Because unfortunately, not unfortunately, we need to have compliance. We need to do what people are calling box ticking, because how else can we show to regulators, and I work for a very highly regulated industry, that we're doing the things that they expect of us? Because if we don't do that basic compliance and we don't get that basic compliance and all these records, how can we show to the regulators we're doing what we need to be? And also, when it comes to legal defences, when people are making claims against you, unfortunately, and it's not health and safety people, I blame lawyers actually, we have to go through lots and lots of hoops to defend ourselves against unsubstantiated claims, particularly where I used to work, that we end up having to do this just to protect our business, just to protect our organisation, from any lawyers here. I'm going to upset you, from crap lawyers. No, not crap lawyers. That's not the right phrase. Unethical
Unscrupulous.
lawyers, shall we say?
That's not my point, Phil, actually. So it is really important that we do all of this stuff, but it's important that we ask the right questions about the things that we're doing afterwards. I do have the misfortune of sitting in both of those camps as well, so being a health and safety practitioner and a lawyer as well. So yes, I get the point, but you know, the reality is we do have to do compliance, but do it well. What does it actually mean? Not what does compliance mean, what does what we found mean? Is it actually good enough? Are we complying with our duties?
It's two stages. Get the compliance right, and then you can move on and do the sexy stuff in health and safety, if I can call it that.
Indeed, but you know, is it good enough? What does it actually mean? So do it all, but actually interpret it as well, because there's an awful lot of stuff that just gets done without anything beyond that. And does that add value? Do we need to do all of it, or do we just do it just because?
Well, if it's in the law, you have to do it because, full stop. Well, no discussion.
That's not quite so, is it? So the law's very goal setting here. So the standards, they change with risk. So the way that we deliver compliance in buildings should be proportionate to the risk that we have in buildings. Don't get me wrong, there are things that are absolutely strict liability duties that we have to do. We have to protect access to dangerous parts of machinery.
They're the things I'm talking about. And unfortunately, and here's perhaps where our regulators need more education as well, is determining that what comes under the strict liability and the blurring around the edges of it. Because yes, there's the strict liability, but there's a lot of we keep using the phrase shades of grey around those edges as well. And perhaps we need our regulators to understand that there are shades of grey. We're using that phrase too. We need a different phrase, don't we, than shades of grey? Just say shades of purple. Nicer colour, isn't it?
There's definitely not many shades of blue after last week's election, so maybe we'll have to go for purple. I think we're all on board that compliant. You know, we have to be compliant. I think what's coming out is agreement that we've got to do that, but we need to do more as well. And I suppose it's kind of how do we do that, and how can we best equip ourselves and our teams to move on from just following the rules and ticking the boxes into having a ethical, responsible, proactive safety culture. I suppose that's where we're all trying to get to, aren't we? Darren, did you want to come back in again?
Yeah, I think we just need to remember that it is important that we do compliance for the particular reasons that Phil was talking about. But we've got to remember that humans are never perfect. And the difficulty is when compliance becomes the focus. And I saw a comment in the chat there earlier about it needs to be more people focused and keeping the people safe, not just the business safe, or what if. And yes, we have these external audits for compliance and everything else, but at the end of the day, they are just a snapshot of what they see at that particular point in time. It's a little bit like your MOT on the car. And too many companies focus on the fact, oh, we've just been re-audited, we've attained that particular standard, we're compliant. It's not the issue is when they don't follow it through at a level or a standard for the rest of the year. And part of the issue around that is human behaviours and human factors. Yeah. Because you could have had an audit yesterday, and because that stress and the effort that audit put you through, you're now very tired and fatigued. You come in the next day, are you still going to be working with the same focus and the same standard to that compliance, or is your mind going to be elsewhere? It could be as simple as having an argument with the other half before you've left the house. It's the human factors is the biggest problem, and it's the same with accidents. They're unplanned and uncontrolled, and the human factors can have the biggest impact on whether you have an incident or you don't, because your focus is elsewhere. And it's that focus shift and not having the same. You cannot the amount of focus you have to give to an external audit to check that you're compliant is not something you can sustain all year. It's just a pinpoint in time. The thing that a lot of people, when I did my refresh and my retrain, which was a weird thing to do at 48, to be honest, go from nothing through to diploma again a second time. I actually, one of the things I picked up at that point, when you talk about compliance, and if you've got an issue and you start applying control measures based on standards to be compliant, is when you start talking about, when applying those control measures, you've thought about the social impact. And it was a big new area for me. I hadn't actually thought about it from my training back in early 2000s. And one of the activities I had when I was retraining was I was a consultant for a shopping centre, and I had to respond to a particular issue they picked up within one page. And they'd had evidence that out the front on the hard standing, they got a 2.5 metre long, a 2.5 metre high, 3 metre long sculpture of a fish. And they got evidence of people climbing on it. And to reduce the risk, you had to respond with some control measures. Now, it depends who you talk to and what their level of risk appetite is and their understanding. People will be saying fencing it, put a glass screen around it, all sorts of things. But actually, you've got a few people out of hundreds of thousands a week who walk past it. And anything you do will detract from what it's there to for how the people who actually walk past it okay are there to enjoy. And so that's the social impact. Unfortunately, if that's, to me, other colleagues in the industry I speak to weren't really aware of it either until I'd mentioned it to them. If we in the industry don't really understand it and are able to apply it, then the people we work for work through, and the people who write the standards aren't necessarily going to be including that in what they're looking for in compliance. So that made it difficult. Obviously, you can't put a fence in the way because it might help them climb. It's got to be a further distance away. And if you did put something a suitable distance away, one, it's going to detract from the view for photo opportunities.
Yeah.
And anything you put in the way, if somebody still climbs it and falls, you're then impeding their emergency services.
Yeah.
And for the sake of a few drunken people after coming out of the pub, because to get up on the thing, you've got to be an adult. So there's a responsible adult for a photo for a child. A responsible adult's got to put them up there, and it's thinking about that social impact. So if we don't necessarily fully understand that or utilise that as an industry, then the standards are never even going to consider it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Good stuff. Just quickly, because I'm conscious of time, a few thoughts here around some of the benefits or the positive outcomes of going beyond just mere compliance. The fact that we can be, firstly, proactive and we can manage our safety risks better and to a higher standard. Secondly, we can improve, build, foster a really much better safety culture, and we know what benefits that can bring. I'm a firm believer that being good at safety helps to build the business. I believe there's a strong link between safety and good business outcomes. So, for the long-term sustainability of the business, I believe that this is important. And then innovation and improvement was the fourth point that I thought about, that the fact that, if we're going beyond the basics, beyond the bare minimums, we can improve productivity, gain a much bigger competitive advantage, etc. Somebody in the chat mentioned reducing costs such as insurance premiums. Obviously, that is a byproduct as well. Phil, did you want to add some thoughts to that?
Yeah, quick one, and I can't find it at the moment. I'll try and find it later. But I read a paper, and actually somebody put it on LinkedIn recently, saying that an academic paper was suggesting that having good health and safety does not necessarily lead to being good business. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I saw that. I think I saw a podcast on that. I need to look into that more because I think there's evidence on both sides of that argument. I think it would potentially vary depending on your sector. maybe the size of your business. But also, I think it's like anything. If you go too overboard in a certain area, then perhaps it might have a negative context. But if you're doing not enough, if you're a 3 out of 10 on safety, and you can improve to a 8 out of 10 on safety, I reckon there'd be a lot of evidence that would produce good business outcomes. If you're already an 8 out of 10 and you invest money to go to a 10 out of 10, it's possible that might not have the same ROI. So yeah, I'll have a look into that. Send me the link if you can find it. Darren.
Two quick things. Going back to what was just being mentioned there about being good at safety doesn't necessarily improve the business or whatever. We utilize a lot of subcontract suppliers, and we undertake a very stringent pre-qualification and annual due diligence process. Obviously, because of the vicarious liability element, a lot of people don't understand why we do it to the level we do. But when companies talk about not working with companies because they haven't got an ISO standard, you could have an ISO standard, but you might not get through my pre-qualification process to work for us. The other thing is, if you go back to the slide you had a second ago, the one talking about the first bullet point, it talked about, that's the one.
This one.
Proactive risk management. The thing that's missing is proactive risk reporting. Most of the people I know and I've worked with, they will report near misses up to RIDDOR's majors fatalities. And a lot of companies will utilize those numbers. Well, we don't have many accidents, so we've obviously got a good culture. And a lot of companies mix up the difference between performance and culture. And they run their compliance program based on having low numbers. Now, one of the things I've implemented in a number of places is some proactive reporting levels before that. And it's breaking down the near miss. So a near miss, if you remember the old bricks on the scaffold typical picture, the brick's fallen off. It's not hit anybody or done any damage, but there is actually something has happened. So in one place, we instigated what we called good spots and excellence. The good spots were broken down into, for instance, if there was a spill on the stairs, it was an unsafe condition. And to get people to take responsibility for it, rather than just walk away and report it, get them to stand by it until somebody has cleared it up, that sort of thing. But it also included, when you go into an area to do an audit or an inspection, the documentation that you expect to see, if it's there and it's correct, that gets recorded under documentation for each one. If it's not, then it goes down as a good spot. If it is, it goes down as an excellence. And when you start collecting that greater detail, and in amongst the extra reporting that anybody can report anything, then we started to get 3,000 reports a year out of 1,000 people across 5 buildings on a campus. Where actually nobody was injured, nothing had actually gone wrong, but all these things weren't correct. And what we had was the excellence figure was lower than the good spot figure to begin with. And as we pushed it and promoted it, they swapped places and they grew further apart. Now, you can take that, it's still subjective like all numeric measures, but you can take that and you can go, okay, so this many people out of the company in that year made the effort to report something. It gives you a vague percentage. And to me, that's more of a measure of culture rather than performance, because it's looking at how many people had actually bothered to proactively look for something and report it. But a lot of companies don't. They focus purely on, we've only had 2 accidents this year. But the thing behind it is, an individual I worked for wanted to bring in accident frequency rate because it's industry standard. it's a standard used in industry. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a standard that the industry should be using. It's a loose term. And I've recently done a pre-qualification on a company that sent me 5 years of their incident numbers, and they use accident frequency rate. So in 2019, they had 3 minors, 1 7-day. And out of that, they employed about 120 people. So out of that, they got their score. In 2021, they had 3 minors, a 7-day, and a fatality. But they employed 300 people.
So they thought it was better.
Using accident frequency rate, they, even though they killed somebody, they got a better score than the year they didn't, because they employed enough people.
Yeah.
Now that sounds a bit third world to me.
Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
When we're looking at compliance, what are we being compliant to, and how are we actually measuring that is the key thing. Is it actually relevant? Does it actually mean anything?
Yeah, agree. Yeah, thanks, Darren. Peter, did you want to come in, and then we'll start wrapping it up, because I'm conscious we're slightly over time.
Yes, I'll be brief. Very good points about like reporting all of like hazards and near misses and focusing more on that. We've actually stopped having a target of injury rate. We don't have it anymore for that reason. But if any of you aren't familiar with Amy Edmondson's work looking at psychological safety, and the studies that she did, it was actually hospital teams, on the teams that had the better health outcomes in hospitals were those teams who reported the most issues and concerns and defects, and it was because their culture was open enough that they were open to report the near miss, the hazard, all of these cases that we're talking about. And therefore they could learn with each other, rather than like a fear of, oh, it's bad to say that you've got defects, especially in the health when you're trying to keep people alive and healthy. So yeah, I'd say if you haven't listened to her, Google that and listen. I think it's really brilliant, and that's not just about physical safety. It's about any part of speaking up and sharing, reporting, whether it's customer feedback or some financial glitches, anything across. And then you really look about organizational culture and not safety culture. But that does drive what we're talking about as well.
Yeah, I like Amy's stuff. I'm trying to get her to come and do a session or a podcast or something, but she's very busy. So, and I've got no budget to pay her. So
she is speaking in October in an HSC conference up in Durham, I think, or somewhere.
She is. Yeah. I think I suspect she's being paid for that.
Yes.
Good on her. She deserves it. Good stuff. Well, look, thank you everybody for joining today. Really, really good session in terms of the level of discussion and interactivity. Hopefully, it's got the juices flowing and you thinking about compliance and to what extent we can get beyond mere compliance. Just quickly before we wrap up, the next Safety Roundtable 2 weeks from today, 24th of July at 12:30. We're going to be talking about serious injuries and fatalities, and asking the question, are you good or just lucky? So hope to see lots of you there for that one.
Go-ahead punk. You forgot the go-ahead punk at the start of
that. Very good. Thanks again for joining. Hope that's got your thinking heads on. Someone's asked about slides to be shared. If you email me, I'm happy to share the slides. Is the recording available? The recording it gets streamed onto LinkedIn. So if you go to my LinkedIn profile, you can always watch the recording of all of these sessions on LinkedIn. But they also all go out on YouTube, and they go out on my Safety and Risk Success podcast as recordings of the audio as well. So there's lots and lots of opportunities to take in this session and all the others. All right, guys.
Christian,
thank you very much.
And everyone for the conversation.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.